Double Birthday by Willa, Cather. Even in American cities, which seem so much alike, where people seem all to be living the same lives, striving for the same things, thinking the same thoughts, there are still individuals a little out of tune with the times. There are still survivals of a past more loosely woven. There are disconcerting beginnings of a future yet unforeseen. Coming out of the gray stone courthouse in Pittsburgh on a dark November afternoon, Judge Hammersley encountered one of these men, whom one does not readily place, whom one is, indeed, a little embarrassed to meet, because they have not got on as they should. The judge saw him mounting the steps outside, leaning against the wind, holding his soft felt hat on with his hand, his head thrust forward, hurrying with a light, quick step, and so intent upon his own purposes that the judge could have gone out by a side door and avoided the meeting, but that was against his principles. "Good day, Albert," he muttered, seeming to feel himself all the embarrassment of the encounter, for the other snatched off his hat with a smile of very evident pleasure and something like pride. His gesture bared an attractive head, small, well-set, definite, and smooth, one of those heads that look as if they had been turned out of some hard, rich wood by a workman deft with the lathe. His smooth-shaven face was dark, a warm coffee color, and his hazel eyes were warm and lively. He was not young, but his features had a kind of quicksilver mobility. His manner toward the stiff, frowning judge was respectful and admiring, not in the least self-conscious. The judge inquired after his health and that of his uncle. "Uncle Albert is splendidly preserved for his age, frail and can't stand any strain, but perfectly all right if he keeps to his routine. He's going to have a birthday soon. He will be 80 on the first day of December, and I shall be 55 on the same day. I was named after him because I was born on his 25th birthday." "Umph." The judge glanced from left to right as if this announcement were in bad taste, but he put a good face on it and said with a kind of testy heartiness, "That will be an occasion. I'd like to remember it in some way. Is there anything your uncle would like? Any recognition?" He stammered and coughed. Young Albert Engelhard, as he was called, laughed apologetically, but with confidence. "I think there is, Judge Hammersley. Indeed, I'd thought of coming to you to ask a favor. I am going to have a little supper for him, and you know he likes good wine. In these dirty, bootlegging times, it's hard to get." "Certainly, certainly." The judge spoke up quickly and for the first time looked Albert squarely in the eye. "Don't give him any of that bootleg stuff. I can find something in my cellar. Come out tomorrow night after 8, with a gripsack of some sort. Very glad to help you out, Albert. Glad the old fellow holds up so well." "Thank ye, Albert," as Engelhard swung the heavy door open and held it for him to pass. Judge Hammersley's car was waiting for him, and on the ride home to Squirrel Hill, he thought with vexation about the Engelhards. He was really a sympathetic man, and though so stern of manner, he had deep affections, was fiercely loyal to old friends, old families, and old ideals. He didn't think highly of what is called success in the world today, but such as it was, he wanted his friends to have it, and was vexed with them when they missed it. He was vexed with Albert for unblushingly, almost proudly, declaring that he was 55 years old, when he had nothing whatever to show for it. He was the last of the Engelhard boys, and they had none of them had anything to show. They all died much worse off in the world than they began. They began with a flourishing glass factory up the river, a comfortable fortune, a fine old house on the park in Allegheny, a good standing in the community, and it was all gone, melted away. Old August Engelhart was a thrifty, energetic man, though pig-headed, Judge Hammersley's friend and one of his first clients. August's 5 sons had sold the factory and wasted the money in fantastic individual enterprises, lost the big house, and now they were all dead except Albert. They ought all to be alive, with estates and factories and families. To be sure, they had that queer German streak in them, but so had old August, and it hadn't prevented his amounting to something. Their bringing up was wrong. August had too free a hand. He was too proud of his 5 handsome boys and too conceited. Too much tennis, Rhine wine punch, music, and silliness. They were always running over to New York, like this Albert. Somebody, when asked what in the world young Albert had ever done with his inheritance, had laughingly replied that he had spent it on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Judge Hammersley didn't see how Albert could hold his head up, He had some small job in the county clerk's office, was dependent upon it, had nothing else but the poor little house on the south side where he lived with his old uncle. The county took care of him for the sake of his father, who had been a gallant officer in the Civil War, and afterward a public-spirited citizen and a generous employer of labor. But as Judge Hammersley had bitterly remarked to Judge Merriman when Albert's name happened to come up, if it weren't for his father's old friends seeing that he got something, that fellow wouldn't be able to make a living. Next to a charge of dishonesty, this was the worst that could be said of any man. Judge Hammersley's house out on Squirrel Hill sat under a grove of very old oak trees. He lived alone, with his daughter, Margaret Parmenter, who was a widow. She had a great many engagements, but she usually managed to dine at home with her father, and that was about as much society as he cared for. His house was comfortable in an old-fashioned way, well appointed, especially the library, the room in which he lived when he was not in bed or at the courthouse. Tonight, when he came down to dinner, Mrs. Parmenter was already at the table, dressed for an evening party. She was tall, handsome, with a fine, easy carriage, and her face was both hard and sympathetic, like her father's. She had not, however, his stiffness of manner, that contraction of the muscles, which was his unconscious protest at any irregularity in the machinery of life. She accepted blunders and accidents smoothly, if not indifferently. As the old colored man pulled back the judge's chair for him, he glanced at his daughter from under his eyebrows. "I saw that son of old Gus Englehart's this afternoon," he said in an angry, challenging tone. As a young girl, his daughter had used to take up the challenge and hotly defend the person who had displeased or disappointed her father. But as she grew older, she was conscious of that same feeling in herself when people fell short of what she expected. And she understood now that when her father spoke as if he were savagely attacking someone, it merely meant that he was disappointed or sorry for them. He never spoke thus of persons for whom he had no feeling. So she said calmly, "Oh, did you really? I haven't seen him for years, not since the war. How was he looking? Shabby?" "Not so shabby as he ought to. That fellow's likely to be in want one of these days." "I'm afraid so," Mrs. Parmenter sighed. "But I believe he would be rather plucky about it." The judge shrugged. "He's coming out here tomorrow night on some business for his uncle. Then I'll have a chance to see for myself. He must look much older. I can't imagine his ever looking really old and settled, though. See that you don't ask him to stay. I don't want the fellow hanging around. He'll transact his business and get it over." He had the face to admit to me that he'll be 55 years old on the 1st of December. He's giving some sort of birthday party for old Albert, ahem. The judge coughed formally, but was unable to check a smile, his lips sarcastic but his eyes full of sly humor. "Can he be as old as that? Yes, I suppose so. When we were both at Mrs. Sterrett's in Rome, I was 15, and he must have been about 30. Her father coughed. "He'd better have been in Homestead." Mrs. Parmenter looked up. That was rather commonplace for her father. "Oh, I don't know. Albert would never have been much use in Homestead, and he was very useful to Mrs. Sterrett in Rome." What did she want the fellow hanging round for? All the men of her family amounted to something. To too much. There must be some butterflies if one is going to give house parties, and the Sterretts and Dents were all heavyweights. He was in Rome a long while, 3 years, I think. He had a gorgeous time. Anyway, he learned to speak Italian very well, and that helps him out now, doesn't it? You still send for him at the courthouse when you need an interpreter? That's not often. He picks up a few dollars. Nice business for his father's son. After dinner, the judge retired to his library, where the gas fire was lit, and his book at hand, with a paper knife inserted, to mark the place where he had left off reading last night at exactly 10:30. On his way, he went to the front door, opened it, turned on the porch light, and looked at the thermometer, making an entry in a little notebook. In a few moments, his daughter, in an evening cloak, stopped at the library door to wish him good night and went down the hall. He listened for the closing of the front door. It was a reassuring sound to him. He liked the feeling of an orderly house, empty for himself and his books all evening. He was deeply read in divinity, philosophy, and in the early history of North America. While Judge Hammersley was settling down to his book, Albert Engelhart was sitting at home in a garnet velvet smoking jacket at an upright piano, playing Schumann's Kreisleriana for his old uncle. They lived, certainly, in a queer part of the city, on one of the dingy streets that run uphill off noisy Carson Street, in a little 2-story brick house, a workingman's house, that Albert's father had taken over long ago in satisfaction of a bad debt. When his father had acquired this building, it was a mere nothing. The Engelharts were then living in their big, many-gabled, so-German house on the park in Allegheny, and they owned many other buildings besides the glass factory up the river. After the father's death, when the sons converted houses and lands into cash, this forgotten little house on the south side had somehow never been sold or mortgaged. A day came when Albert, the last surviving son, found this piece of property the only thing he owned in the world, besides his personal effects. His uncle, having had a crushing disappointment, wanted at that time to retire from the practice of medicine, so Albert settled in the South Side house and took his uncle with him. He had not gone there in any mood of despair. His impoverishment had come about gradually, and before he took possession of these quarters, he had been living in a boarding house. The change seemed going up instead of going down in the world. He was delighted to have a home again, to unpack his own furniture and his books and pictures, the most valuable in the world to him, because they were full of his own history, and that of his family were like part of his own personality. All the years and the youth which had slipped away from him still clung to these things. At his piano, under his Degas drawing in black and red, 3 ballet girls at the bar, or seated at his beautiful inlaid writing table, he was still the elegant young man who sat there long ago. His rugs were fine ones, his collection of books was large and very personal. It was full of works which, though so recent, were already immensely far away and diminished. The glad, rebellious excitement they had once caused in the world he could recapture only in memory. Their power to seduce and stimulate the young, the living, was utterly gone. There was a complete file of the Yellow Book, for instance. Who could extract sweet poison from those volumes now? A portfolio of the drawings of Aubrey Beardsley, decadent, had they been called, a slender, padded volume, the complete works of a great new poet, Ernest Dowson, Oscar Wilde, whose wickedness was now so outdone that he looked like the poor old hat of some Victorian belle, wired and feathered and garlanded and faded. Albert and his uncle occupied only the upper floor of their house. The ground floor was let to an old German glass engraver who had once been a workman in August Engelhart's factory. His wife was a good cook, and every night sent their dinner up hot on the dumbwaiter. The house opened directly upon the street, and to reach Albert's apartment one went down a narrow paved alley at the side of the building and mounted an outside flight of wooden stairs at the back. They had only 4 rooms, 2 bedrooms, a snug sitting room in which they dined, and a small kitchen where Albert got breakfast every morning. After he had gone to work, Mrs. Rudder came up from downstairs to wash the dishes and do the cleaning, and to cheer up old Dr. Engelhart. At dinner this evening, Albert had told his uncle about meeting Judge Hammersley and of his particular inquiries after his health. The old man was very proud, and received this intelligence as his due, but could not conceal a certain gratification. "The daughter, she still lives with him? A damned fine-looking woman," he muttered between his teeth. Uncle Albert, a bachelor, had been a professed connoisseur of ladies in his day. Immediately after dinner, unless he were going somewhere, Albert always played for his uncle for an hour. He played extremely well. Dr. Albert sat by the fire smoking his cigar. While he listened, the look of wisdom and professional authority faded, and many changes went over his face, as if he were playing a little drama to himself. Moods of scorn and contempt, of rakish vanity, sentimental melancholy, and something remote and lonely. The doctor had always flattered himself that he resembled a satyr, because the tops of his ears were slightly pointed, and he used to hint to his nephews that his large, pendulous nose was the index of an excessively amorous disposition. His mouth was full of long, yellowish teeth, all crowded irregularly, which he snapped and ground together when he uttered denunciations of modern art, or the 18th Amendment. He wore his mustache short and twisted up at the corners. His thick gray hair was cut close and upright in the bristling French fashion. His hands were small and fastidious, high-knuckled, quite elegant in shape. Across the doctor's throat ran a long, jagged scar. He used to mutter to his young nephews that it had been justly inflicted by an outraged husband, a pistol shot in the dark. But his brother August always said that he had been cut by glass when, wandering about in the garden one night after drinking too much punch, he had fallen into the cold frames. After playing Schumann for some time, Albert, without stopping, went into Stravinsky. Dr. Engelhard by the gas fire stirred uneasily, turned his important head toward his nephew, and snapped his teeth. "Brrr, that stuff!" Poverty of imagination, poverty of musical invention, fin de siècle. Albert laughed. "I thought you were asleep. Why will you use that phrase? It shows your vintage. Like this any better?" He began the second act of Pelléas et Mélisande. The doctor nodded. "Yes, that is better, though I'm not fooled by it." He wrinkled his nose as if he were smelling out something and squinted with superior discernment. "To this canaille that is all very new, but to me it goes back to Bach." "Yes, if you like." Albert, like Judge Hammersley, was jealous of his solitude. Liked a few hours with his books. It was time for Uncle Doctor to be turning in. He ended the music by playing half a dozen old German songs which the old fellow always wanted but never asked for. The doctor's chin sank into his shirt front. His face took on a look of deep, resigned sadness. His features, losing their conscious importance, seemed to shrink a good deal. His nephew knew that this was the mood in which he would most patiently turn to rest in darkness. Dr. Engelhard had had a heavy loss late in life. Indeed, he had suffered the same loss twice. As Albert left the piano, the doctor rose and walked a little stiffly across the room. At the door of his chamber he paused, brought his hand up in a kind of military salute, and gravely bowed, so low that one saw only the square, upstanding gray brush on the top of his head and the long pear-shaped nose. After this he closed the door behind him. Albert sat down to his book. Very soon he heard the bath water running. Having taken his bath, the doctor would get into bed immediately to avoid catching cold. Luckily, he usually slept well. Perhaps he dreamed of that unfortunate young singer whom he sometimes called, to his nephew and himself, the lost Lenore. Long years ago, when the Engelhard boys were still living in the old house in Allegheny with their mother, after their father's death, Dr. Engelhard was practicing medicine and had an office on the park, 5 minutes' walk from his sister-in-law. He usually lunched with the family after his morning office hours were over. They always had a good cook, and the Allegheny market was one of the best in the world. Mrs. Engelhard went to market every morning of her life. Such vegetables and poultry, such cheeses and sausages and smoked and pickled fish as one could buy there. Soon after she had made her rounds, boys in white aprons would come running across the park with her purchases. Everyone knew the Engelhard house, built of many-colored bricks with gables and turrets, and on the west, a large stained-glass window representing a scene on the Grand Canal in Venice, the church of Santa Maria della Salute in the background, in the foreground, a gondola with a slender gondolier. People said August and Mrs. Engelhard should be solidly seated in the prow to make the picture complete. Dr. Engelhardt's especial interest was the throat, preferably the singing throat. He had studied every scrap of manuscript that Manuel Garcia had left behind him, every reported conversation with him. He had doctored many singers, and imagined he had saved many voices. Pittsburgh air is not good for the throat, and traveling artists often had need of medical assistance. Conductors of orchestras and singing societies recommended Dr. Engelhard because he was very lax about collecting fees from professionals, especially if they sent him a photograph floridly inscribed. He had been a medical student in New York while Patty was still singing. His biography fell into chapters of great voices, as a turfman's falls into chapters of fast horses. This passion for the voice had given him the feeling of distinction, of being unique in his profession, which had made him all his life a well-satisfied and happy man, and had left him a poor one. One morning when the doctor was taking his customary walk about the park before office hours, he stopped in front of the Allegheny High School building because he heard singing, a chorus of young voices. It was June, and the chapel windows were open. The doctor listened for a few moments, then tilted his head on one side and laid his forefinger on his pear-shaped nose with an anxious, inquiring squint. Among the voices, he certainly heard one voice. The final bang of the piano was followed by laughter and buzzing. A boy ran down the steps. The doctor stopped him and learned that this was a rehearsal for class day exercises. Just then, the piano began again, and in a moment he heard the same voice alone. Still wie die Nacht, tief wie das Meer. No, he was not mistaken. A full, rich soprano voice, so easy, so sure, a golden warmth even in the high notes. Before the second verse was over, he went softly into the building, into the chapel, and for the first time laid eyes on Marguerite Thiesinger. He saw a sturdy, blooming German girl standing beside the piano. Good-natured, one knew at a glance, glowing with health. She looked like a big peony just burst into bloom and full of sunshine. Sunshine in her auburn hair, in her rather small hazel eyes. When she finished the song, she began waltzing on the platform with one of the boys. Dr. Albert waited by the door and accosted her as she came out carrying her coat and schoolbooks. He introduced himself and asked her if she would go over to Mrs. Engelhardt's for lunch and sing for him. Oh, yes, she knew one of the Engelhardt boys, and she'd always wanted to see that beautiful window from the inside. She went over at noon and sang for them before lunch, and the family took stock of her. She spoke a very ordinary German, and her English was still worse. Her people were very ordinary. Her flat, slangy speech was somehow not vulgar because it was naive. She knew no other way. The boys were delighted with her because she was jolly and interested in everything. She told them about the glorious good times she had going to dances in suburban Turner halls and to picnics in the damp, smoke-smeared woods up the Allegheny. The boys roared with laughter at the unpromising places she mentioned, but she had the warm bubble in her blood that makes everything fair. Even being a junior in the Allegheny High School was glorious, she told them. She came to lunch with them again and again because she liked the boys and she thought the house magnificent. The doctor observed her narrowly all the while. Clearly she had no ambition, no purpose. She sang to be agreeable. She was not very intelligent, but she had a kind of personal warmth that, to his way of thinking, was much better than brains. He took her over to his office and poked and pounded her. When he had finished his examination, he stood before the foolish, happy young thing and inclined his head in his peculiar fashion. Miss Thiesinger, I have the honor to announce to you that you are on the threshold of a brilliant, possibly a great career. She laughed her fresh, ringing laugh. Aren't you nice, though, to take so much trouble about me? The doctor lifted a forefinger. But for that, you must turn your back on this childishness, these sniveling sappheads you play marbles with. You must uproot this triviality. He made a gesture as if he were wringing a chicken's neck, and Marguerite was thankful she was able to keep back a giggle. Dr. Engelhardt wanted her to go to New York with him at once and begin her studies. He was quite ready to finance her. He had made up his mind to stake everything upon this voice, but not at all. She thought it was lovely of him, but she was very fond of her classmates, and she wanted to graduate with her class next year. Moreover, she had just been given a choir position in one of the biggest churches in Pittsburgh, though she was still a schoolgirl. She was going to have money and pretty clothes for the first time in her life, and wouldn't miss it all for anything. All through the next school year, Dr. Albert went regularly to the church where she sang, watched and cherished her, expostulated and lectured, trying to awaken fierce ambition in his big peony flower. She was very much interested in other things just then, but she was patient with him, accepted his devotion with good nature, respected his wisdom, and bore with his stagey manners, as she called them. She graduated in June, and immediately after commencement, when she was not quite 19, she eloped with an insurance agent and went to Chicago to live. She wrote Dr. Albert, I do appreciate all your kindness to me, but I guess I will let my voice rest for the present. He took it hard. He burned her photographs and the foolish little scrawls she had written to thank him for presents. His life would have been dull and empty if he hadn't had so many reproaches to heap upon her in his solitude. How often and how bitterly he arraigned her for the betrayal of so beautiful a gift. Where did she keep it hidden now, that jewel, in the sordid life she had chosen? 3 years after her elopement, suddenly, without warning, Marguerite Thiesinger walked into his office on Arch Street one morning and told him she had come back to study. Her husband's affairs were involved. He was now quite willing that she should make as much as possible of her voice, and out of it. "My voice is better than it was," she said, looking at him out of her rather small eyes, greenish-yellow with a glint of gold in them. He believed her. He suddenly realized how uncommonly truthful she had always been, rather stupid, unimaginative, but carried joyously along on a flood of warm vitality, and truthful to a degree he had hardly known in any woman or in any man. And now she was a woman. He took her over to his sister-in-law's. Albert, who chanced to be at home, was sent to the piano. She was not mistaken. The doctor kept averting his head to conceal his delight, to conceal once or twice a tear, the moisture that excitement and pleasure brought to his eyes. The voice, after all, he told himself, is a physical thing. She had been growing and ripening like fruit in the sun, and the voice with the body. Dr. Engelhard stepped softly out of the music room into the conservatory and addressed a potted palm, his lips curling back from his teeth. "So we get that out of you, Monsieur le Commis Voyageur, and now we throw you away like a squeezed lemon." When he returned to his singer, she addressed him very earnestly from under her spring hat covered with lilacs. "Before my marriage, Dr. Engelhard, you offered to take me to New York to a teacher and lend me money to start on. If you still feel like doing it, I'm sure I could repay you before very long. I'll follow your instructions. What was it you used to tell me I must have? Application and ambition." He glared at her. "Take note, Gretchen, that I changed the prescription. There is something vulgar about ambition. Now we will play for higher stakes. For ambition, read aspiration." His index finger shot upward. In New York, he had no trouble in awakening the interest of his friends and acquaintances. Within a week, he had got his protégée to a very fine artist, just then retiring from the opera, a woman who had been a pupil of Pauline Garcia Villardo. In short, Dr. Engelhard had realized the dream of a lifetime. He had discovered a glorious voice, backed by a rich vitality. Within a year, Marguerite had one of the best church positions in New York. She insisted upon repaying her benefactor before she went abroad to complete her studies. Dr. Engelhard went often to New York to counsel and advise, to gloat over his treasure. He often shivered as he crossed the Jersey ferry. He was afraid of fate. He would tell over her assets on his fingers to reassure himself. You might have seen a small, self-important man of about 50. Standing by the rail of the ferry boat, his head impressively inclined as if he were addressing an amphitheater full of students, gravely counting upon his fingers. But fate struck, and from the quarter least under suspicion. Through that blooming, rounded, generously molded young body, from that abundant, glowing health which the doctor proudly called peasant vigor, Marguerite's success had brought to his office many mothers of singing daughters. He was not insensible to the compliment, but he usually dismissed them by dusting his fingers delicately in the air and growling, "Yes, she can sing a little, she has a voice, aber kleine, kleine." He exulted in the opulence of his cabbage rose. To his nephews he used to match her possibilities with the singers of that period. Emma Eames he called Die Puritain. Geraldine Farrar, La Voix Blanche. Another was Trop Raffinée. Marguerite had been in New York 2 years, her path one of uninterrupted progress, when she wrote the doctor about a swelling of some sort. The surgeons wanted to operate. Dr. Albert took the next train for New York. An operation revealed that things were very bad indeed, a malignant growth, so far advanced that the knife could not check it. Her mother and grandmother had died of the same disease. Poor Marguerite lived a year in a hospital for incurables. Every weekend when Dr. Albert went over to see her, he found great changes. It was rapid and terrible. That winter and spring he lived like a man lost in a dark morass, the slave in the dismal swamp. He suffered more than his Gretchen, for she was singularly calm and hopeful to the very end, never doubting that she would get well. The last time he saw her, she had given up, but she was noble and sweet in mood and so piteously apologetic for disappointing him, like a child who has broken something precious and is sorry. She was wasted indeed, until she was scarcely larger than a child, her beautiful hair cut short, her hands like shadows, but still a stain of color in her cheeks. "I'm so sorry I didn't do as you wanted instead of running off with Phil," she said. "I see now how little he cared about me, and you've just done everything. If I had my 26 years to live over, I'd live them very differently." Dr. Albert dropped her hand and walked to the window, the tears running down his face. Pourquoi? Pourquoi? He muttered, staring blindly at that brutal square of glass. When he could control himself and came back to the chair at her bedside, she put her poor little sheared head out on his knee and lay smiling and breathing softly. I expect you don't believe in the hereafter, she murmured. Scientific people hardly ever do. But if there is one, I'll not forget you. I'll love to remember you. When the nurse came to give her hypodermic, Dr. Albert went out into Central Park and wandered about without knowing where or why, until he smelled something sweet which suddenly stopped his breath, and he sat down under a flowering linden tree. He dropped his face in his hands and cried like a woman. Youth, art, love, dreams, true-heartedness, why must they go out of the summer world into darkness? Warum, warum? He thought he had already suffered all that man could, but never had it come down on him like this. He sat on that bench like a drunken man, or like a dying man, muttering Heine's words. God is a grimmer humorist than I. Nobody but God could have perpetrated anything so cruel. She was ashamed. He remembered it afresh and struck his bony head with his clenched fist. Ashamed at having been used like this. She was apologetic for the power, whatever it was, that had tricked her. Yes, by God, she apologized for God. The tortured man looked up through the linden branches at the blue arch that never answers. As he looked, his face relaxed. His breathing grew regular. His eyes were caught by puffy white clouds, like the cherub heads in Raphael's pictures, and something within him seemed to rise and travel with those clouds. The moment had come when he could bear no more. When he went back to the hospital that evening, he learned that she had died very quietly between 11 and 12, the hour when he was sitting on the bench in the park. Uncle Doctor now sometimes spoke to Albert out of a long silence. Anyway, I died for her. That was given to me. She never knew a death struggle. She went to sleep. That struggle took place in my body. Her dissolution occurred within me. Old Dr. Engelhardt walked abroad very little now. Sometimes, on a fine Sunday, his nephew would put him aboard a streetcar that climbs the hills beyond Mount Oliver and take him to visit an old German graveyard and a monastery. Every afternoon, in good weather, he walked along the pavement which ran past the front door as far as the first corner, where he bought his paper and cigarettes. If Elsa, the pretty little granddaughter of his housekeeper, ran out to join him and see him over the crossings, he would go a little farther. In the morning, while Mrs. Rudder did the sweeping and dusting, the doctor took the air on an upstairs back porch, overhanging the court. The court was bricked and had an old-fashioned cistern and hydrant, and 3 ailanthus trees, the last growing things left to the Engelhardts, whose flowering shrubs and greenhouses had once been so well known in Allegheny. In these trees, which he called les chinoises, the doctor took a great interest. The clothesline ran about their trunks in a triangle, and on Mondays he looked down upon the washing. He was too nearsighted to be distressed by the sooty flakes descending from neighboring chimneys upon the white sheets. He enjoyed the dull green leaves of his chinoises in summer, scarcely moving on breathless, sticky nights, when the moon came up red over roofs and smokestacks. In autumn he watched the yellow fronds drop down upon the brick pavement like great ferns. Now, when his birthday was approaching, the trees were bare, and he thought he liked them best so, especially when all the knotty, curly twigs were outlined by a scurf of snow. As he sat there wrapped up in rugs, a stiff felt hat on his head, he would never hear to a cap, and woolen gloves on his hands, Elsa, the granddaughter, would bring her cross-stitch and chatter to him. Of late she had been sewing on her trousseau, and that amused the doctor highly, though it meant she would soon go to live in Lower Allegheny, and he would lose her. Her young man, Karl Aberbach, had now a half-interest in a butcher stall in the Allegheny market, and was in a hurry to marry. When Mrs. Rudder had quite finished her work and made the place neat, she would come and lift the rug from his knees and say, "Time to go in, Herr Doctor." The next evening after dinner, Albert left the house with a suitcase, the bag that used to make so many trips to New York in the opera season. He stopped downstairs to ask Elsa to carry her sewing up and sit with his uncle for a while. Then he took the streetcar across the 22nd Street Bridge by the blazing steel mills. As he waited on Soho Hill to catch a Fifth Avenue car, The heavy, frosty air suddenly began to descend in snowflakes. He wished he had worn his old overcoat, didn't like to get this one wet. He had to consider such things now. He was hesitating about a taxi when his car came bound for the East End. He got off at the foot of one of the streets running up Squirrel Hill and slowly mounted. Everything was white with the softly falling snow. Albert knew all the places. Old school friends lived in many of them. Big, turreted stone houses, set in ample grounds with fine trees and shrubbery and driveways. He stepped aside now and then to avoid a car, rolling from the gravel drives onto the stone block pavement. If the occupants had recognized Albert, they would have felt sorry for him. But he did not feel sorry for himself. He looked up at the lighted windows, the red gleam on the snowy rhododendron bushes, and shrugged. His old schoolfellows went to New York now as often as he had done in his youth. But they went to consult doctors, to put children in school, or to pay the bills of incorrigible sons. He thought he had had the best of it. He had gone a-Maying while it was May. This solid comfort, this iron-bound security, didn't appeal to him much. These massive houses, after all, held nothing but the heavy domestic routine, all the frictions and jealousies and discontents of family life. Albert felt light and free, going up the hill in his thin overcoat. He believed he had had a more interesting life than most of his friends who owned real estate. He could still amuse himself, and he had lived to the full all the revolutions in art and music that his period covered. He wouldn't at this moment exchange his life and his memories of his teacher, Raphael Josephi, for instance, for any one of these massive houses and the life of the man who paid the upkeep. If Mephistopheles were to emerge from the rhododendrons and stand behind his shoulder with such an offer, he wouldn't hesitate. Money? Oh yes, he would like to have some, but not what went with it. He turned in under Judge Hammersley's fine oak trees. A car was waiting in the driveway near the steps by which he mounted to the door. The colored man admitted him, and just as he entered the hall, Mrs. Parmenter came down the stairs. "Ah, it's you, Albert. Father said you were coming in this evening, and I've kept the car waiting to have a glimpse of you." Albert had dropped his hat and bag and stood holding her hand with the special grace and appreciation she remembered in him. "What a pleasure to see you," he exclaimed, and she knew from his eyes it was. "It doesn't happen often, but it's always such a surprise and pleasure." He held her hand as if he wanted to keep her there. "It's a long while since the Villa Scipione, isn't it?" They stood for a moment in the shrouded hall light. Mrs. Parmenter was looking very handsome, and Albert was thinking that she had all her father's authority, with much more sweep and freedom. She was impulsive and careless, where he was strong and shrinking, a powerful man terribly afraid of little annoyances. His daughter, Albert believed, was not afraid of anything. She had proved more than once that if you aren't afraid of gossip, it is harmless. She did as she pleased. People took it. Even Parmenter had taken it, and he was rather a stiff sort. Mrs. Parmenter laughed at his allusion to their summer at Mrs. Sterrett's in Rome, and gave him her coat to hold. "You remember, Albert, how you and I used to get up early on fete days, and go down to the garden gate to see the young king come riding in from the country at the head of the horse guards? How the sun flashed on his helmet! Heavens, I saw him last summer." So grizzled and battered. "And we were always going to run away to Russia together, and now there is no Russia. Everything has changed but you, Mrs. Parmenter." "Wish I could think so, but you don't know any Mrs. Parmenter." "I'm Marjorie, please. How often I think of those gay afternoons I had with you and your brothers in the garden behind your old Allegheny house. There's such a lot I want to talk to you about. And this birthday, when is it? May I send your uncle some flowers? I always remember his goodness to poor Marguerite Thiesinger. He never got over that, did he? But I'm late, and Father is waiting. Good night, you'll have a message from me." Albert bent and kissed her hand in the old-fashioned way, keeping it a moment, and breathing in softly the fragrance of her clothes, her furs, her person, the fragrance of that other world to which he had once belonged, and out of which he had slipped so gradually that he scarcely realized it, unless suddenly brought face to face with something in it that was charming. Releasing her, he caught up his hat and opened the door to follow her, but she pushed him back with her arm and smiled over her shoulder. "No, no, Father is waiting for you in the library. Good night." Judge Hammersley stood in the doorway, fingering a bunch of keys and blinking with impatience to render his service and have done with it. The library opened directly into the hall. He couldn't help overhearing his daughter, and he disliked her free and unreproachful tone with this man who was young when he should be old, single when he should be married, and penniless when he should be well fixed. Later, as Albert came down the hill with 2 bottles of the judge's best champagne in his bag, he was thinking that the greatest disadvantage of being poor and dropping out of the world was that he didn't meet attractive women anymore. The men he could do without, heaven knew. But the women, the ones like Marjorie Hammersley, were always grouped where the big fires burned. Money and success and big houses and fast boats and French cars. It was natural. Mrs. Parmenter, as she drove off, resolved that she would see more of Albert and his uncle. Wondered why she had let an old friendship lapse for so long. When she was a little girl, she used often to spend a week with her aunt in Allegheny. She was fond of the aunt, but not of her cousins, and she used to escape whenever she could to the Englehards' garden only a few doors away. No grass in that garden. In Allegheny grass was always dirty, but glittering gravel, and lilac hedges beautiful in spring, and barberry hedges red in the fall, and flowers in bird cages and striped awnings, boys lying about in tennis clothes making mint juleps before lunch, having coffee under the sycamore trees after dinner. The Englehart boys were different, like people in a book or a play. All the young men in her set were scornful of girls until they wanted one. Then they grabbed her rather brutally, and it was over. She had felt that the Englehart boys admired her without in the least wanting to grab her, that they enjoyed her aesthetically, so to speak, and it pleased her to be liked in that way. 5. On the afternoon of the 1st of December, Albert left his desk in the county clerk's office at 4 o'clock, feeling very much as he used to when school was dismissed in the middle of the afternoon just before the Christmas holidays. It was his uncle's birthday that was in his mind. His own, of course, gave him no particular pleasure. If one stopped to think of that, there was a shiver waiting round the corner. He walked over the Smithfield Street Bridge. A thick brown fog made everything dark, and there was a feeling of snow in the air. The lights along the sheer cliffs of Mount Washington, high above the river, were already lighted. When Albert was a boy, those cliffs, with the row of lights far up against the sky, always made him think of some faraway, cloud-set city in Asia. The Forbidden City, he used to call it. Well, that was a long time ago. A lot of water had run under this bridge since then, and kingdoms and empires had fallen. Meanwhile, Uncle Doctor was still hanging on, and things were not so bad with them as they might be. Better not reflect too much. He hopped on board a streetcar, and old women with market baskets shifted to make room for him. When he reached home, the table was already set in the living room. Beautiful table linen had been one of his mother's extravagances. He had boxes of it, meant to give some to Elsa on her marriage, and Mrs. Rudder laundered it with pious care. She had put out the best silver. He had forgotten to order flowers, but the old woman had brought up one of her blooming geraniums for a centerpiece. Uncle Albert was dozing by the fire in his old smoking jacket, a volume of Schiller on his knees. "I'll put the studs in your shirt for you. Time to dress, Uncle Doctor." The old man blinked and smiled drolly. "So, die Clawhammer?" "Of course die Clawhammer. Elsa is going to a masquerade with Carl, and they are coming up to see us before they go. I promised her you would dress." "Albert," the doctor called him back, beckoned with a mysterious smile. "Where did you get that wine now?" "Oh, you found it when she put it on ice, did you? That's Judge Hammersley's, the best he had. He insisted on sending it to you, with his compliments and good wishes." Uncle Albert rose and drew up his shoulders somewhat pompously. "From my own kind, I still command recognition." Then, dropping into homely vulgarity, he added, with a sidelong squint at his nephew, "By God, some of that will feel good, running down the gullet." "You'll have all you want for once. It's a great occasion. Did you shave carefully? I'll take my bath, and then you must be ready for me." In half an hour, Albert came out in his dress clothes and found his uncle still reading his favorite poet. "The trousers are too big," the doctor complained. "Why not dye Clawhammer in my old trousers? Elsa wouldn't notice." Oh yes, she would. She's seen these every day for 5 years. Quick change. Dr. Engelhardt submitted, and when he was dressed, surveyed himself in his mirror with satisfaction, though he slyly slipped a cotton handkerchief into his pocket, instead of the linen one Albert had laid out. When they came back to the sitting room, Mrs. Rudder had been up again and had put on the wine glasses. There was still half an hour before dinner, and Albert sat down to play for his uncle. He was beginning to feel that it was all much ado about nothing, after all. A gentle tap at the door, and Elsa came in with her young man. She was dressed as a Polish maiden, and Karl Aberbach was in a Highlander's kilt. "Congratulations on your birthday, Herr Doctor, and I've brought you some flowers." She went to his chair and bent down to be kissed, putting a bunch of violets in his hand. The doctor rose and stood looking down at the violets. "Hey, you take me for a Bonapartist? What is Mussolini's flower, Albert? Advise your friends in Rome that a supreme dictator should always have a flower." He turned the young girl around in the light and teased her about her thin arms. Such an old joke, but she laughed for him. "But that's the style now, Herr Doctor. Everybody wants to be as thin as possible." "Bah, there are no styles in such things. A man will always want something to take hold of, till hell freezes over." "Is dat so, Karl?" Karl, a very broad-faced, smiling young man with outstanding ears, was suddenly frightened into silence by the entrance of a fine lady, and made for the door to get his knotty knees into the shadow. Elsa, too, caught her breath and shrank away. Without knocking, Mrs. Parmenter, her arms full of roses, appeared in the doorway, and just behind her was her chauffeur, carrying a package. "Put it down there and wait for me," she said to him, then swept into the room and lightly embraced Dr. Engelhardt, without waiting to drop the flowers or take off her furs. "I wanted to congratulate you in person. They told me below that you were receiving. Please take these flowers, Albert. I want a moment's chat with Dr. Engelhardt." The doctor stood with singular gravity, like someone in a play, the violets still in his hand. "To what?" he muttered with his best bow. "To what am I indebted for such distinguished consideration? To your own distinction, my dear sir, always one of the most distinguished men I ever knew." The doctor, to whom flattery was thrice dearer than to ordinary men, flushed deeply. But he was not so exalted that he did not notice his little friend of many lonely hours slipping out of the entryway. The bare-kneed Highland chief had already got down the wooden stairs. "Elsa," he called commandingly, "come here and kiss me good night." He pulled her forward. "This is Elsa Rudder, Mrs. Parmenter, and my very particular friend. You should have seen her beautiful hair before she cut it off." Elsa reddened and glanced up to see whether the lady understood. Uncle Doctor kissed her on the forehead and ran his hand over her shingled head. 19 years, he said softly. "If the next 19 are as happy, we won't bother about the rest. Behut got her." "Thank you, Uncle Doctor. Good night." After she fluttered out, he turned to Mrs. Parmenter. "That little girl," he said impressively, "is the rose in winter. She is my heir. Everything I have, I leave to her." "Everything but my birthday present, please. You must drink that. I've brought you a bottle of champagne." Both Alberts began to laugh. "But your father has already given us 2. Mrs. Parmenter looked from one to the other. "My father? Well, that is a compliment. It's unheard of. Of course he and I have different lockers. We could never agree when to open them. I don't think he's opened his since the Chief Justice dined with him. Now I must leave you. Be as jolly as the night is long. With 3 bottles you ought to do very well. The good woman downstairs said your dinner would be served in half an hour." Both men started toward her. "Don't go. Please, please, stay and dine with us. It's the one thing we needed." Bert began to entreat her in Italian, a language his uncle did not understand. He confessed that he had been freezing up for the last hour, couldn't go on with it alone. One can't do such things without a woman. A beautiful woman. "Thank you, Albert, but I've a dinner engagement. I ought to be at the far end of Ellsworth Avenue this minute." "But this is once in a lifetime, for him. Still, if your friends are waiting for you, you can't. Certainly not." He took up her coat and held it for her. But how the light had gone out of his face. He looked so different, so worn, as he stood holding her coat at just the right height. She slipped her arms into it, then pulled them out. "I can't, but I just will. Let me write a note, please." I'll send Henry on with it and tell them I'll drop in after dinner." Albert pressed her hand gratefully and took her to his desk. "Oh, Albert, your Italian writing table, and all the lovely things on it, just as it stood in your room at the Villa Scipione. You used to let me write letters at it. You had the nicest way with young girls. If I had a daughter, I'd want you to do it all over again." She scratched a note, and Albert put a third place at the table. He noticed Uncle Doctor slip away and come back with his necktie set straight, attended by a wave of eau de cologne. While he was lighting the candles and bringing in the wine cooler, Mrs. Parmenter sat down beside the doctor, accepted one of his cigarettes, and began to talk to him simply and naturally about Marguerite Theisinger. Nothing could have been more tactful, Albert knew. Nothing could give the old man more pleasure on his birthday. Albert himself couldn't do it any more. He had worn out his power of going over that sad story. He tried to make up for it by playing the songs she had sung. "Albert," said Mrs. Parmenter when they sat down to dinner, "this is the only spot I know in the world that is before the war. You've got a period shut up in here, the last 10 years of one century and the first 10 of another. Sitting here, I don't believe in aeroplanes or jazz or cubists. My father is nearly as old as Dr. Engelhardt, and we never buy anything new, yet we haven't kept it out. How do you manage?" Albert smiled a little ruefully. "I suppose it's because we never have any young people about. They bring it in." "Elsa," murmured the doctor, "but I see, she is only a child." "I'm sorry for the young people now," Mrs. Parmenter went on. "They seem to me coarse and bitter. There's nothing wonderful left for them, poor things. The war destroyed it all. Where could any girl find such a place to escape to as your mother's house, full of chests of linen like this? All houses now are like hotels, nothing left to cherish. Your house was wonderful, and what music we used to have. Do you remember the time you took me to hear Josephi play the second Brahms with Gericke? It was the last time I ever heard him. What did happen to him, Albert? Went to pieces in some way, didn't he?" Albert sighed and shook his head. Wine was apt to plunge him into pleasant, poetic melancholy. "I don't know if anyone knows. I stayed in Rome too long to know myself. Before I went abroad, I'd been taking lessons with him right along. I saw no change in him, though he gave fewer and fewer concerts. When I got back, I wrote him the day I landed in New York. He was living up the Hudson then. I got a reply from his housekeeper, saying that he was not giving lessons, was ill, and was seeing nobody. I went out to his place at once. I wasn't asked to come into the house. I was told to wait in the garden. I waited a long while. At last he came out, wearing white clothes as he often did, a Panama hat, carrying a little cane. He shook hands with me, asked me about Mrs. Sterrett, but he was another man, that's all. He was gone, he wasn't there. I was talking to his picture." "Drugs," muttered the doctor out of one corner of his mouth. "Nonsense," Albert shrugged in derision. Or if he did, that was secondary, a result, not a cause. He'd seen the other side of things. He'd let go. Something had happened in his brain that was not paresis. Mrs. Parmenter leaned forward. "Did he look the same? Surely he had the handsomest head in the world. Remember his forehead? Was he gray? His hair was a reddish chestnut, as I remember." "A little gray, not much. There was no change in his face, except his eyes. The bright spark had gone out, and his body had a sort of trailing languor when he moved." "Would he give you a lesson?" "No, said he wasn't giving any. Said he was sorry, but he wasn't seeing people at all anymore. I remember he sat making patterns in the gravel with his cane. He frowned and said he simply couldn't see people. Said the human face had become hateful to him, and the human voice. 'I am sorry,' he said, 'but that is the truth.'" I looked at his left hand, lying on his knee. "I wonder, Marjorie, that I had the strength to get up and go away. I felt as if everything had been drawn out of me. He got up and took my hand. I understood that I must leave. In desperation, I asked him whether music didn't mean anything to him still. 'Music,' he said slowly, with just a ghost of his old smile. 'Yes, some music.' He went back into the house. Those were the last words I ever heard him speak. Oh dear, and he had everything that is beautiful, and the name of an angel. But we're making the doctor melancholy. Open another bottle, Albert. Father did very well by you. We've not drunk a single toast. Many returns we take for granted. Why not each drink a toast of our own to something we care for?" She glanced at Dr. Engelhardt, who lifted the bunch of violets by his plate and smelled them absently. "Now, Dr. Engelhardt, a toast!" The doctor put down his flowers, delicately took up his glass, and held it directly in front of him. Everything he did with his hands was deft and sure. A wonderful look came over his face as she watched him. "I drink," he said slowly, to a memory, to the lost Lenore. "And I," said young Albert softly, "to my youth, to my beautiful youth." Tears flashed into Mrs. Parminter's eyes. "Ah," she thought, "that's what liking people amounts to. It's liking their silliness and absurdities. That's what it really is." "And I," she said aloud, "will drink to the future, to our renewed friendship and many dinners together. I like you two better than anyone I know." When Albert came back from seeing Mrs. Parminter down to her car, he found his uncle standing by the fire, his elbow on the mantel, thoughtfully rolling a cigarette. "Albert," he said in a deeply confidential tone, "good wine, good music, beautiful women, that is all there is worth turning over the hand for." Albert began to laugh. The old man wasn't often banal. "Why, Uncle, you and Martin Luther?" The doctor lifted a hand imperiously to stop him and flushed darkly. He evidently hadn't been aware that he was quoting. It came from the heart. "Martin Luther," he snapped, "was a vulgarian of the first water, cabbage soup." He paused a moment to light his cigarette. "But don't fool yourself. One like her always knows when a man has had success with women." Albert poured a last glass from the bottle and sipped it critically. "Well, you had success tonight, certainly. I could see that Marjorie was impressed. She's coming to take you for a ride tomorrow after your nap, so you must be ready." The doctor passed his flexible, nervous hand lightly over the thick bristles of his French haircut. "Even in our ashes," he muttered haughtily,